The blackout. The clock on the wall read 11:58 p.m. as Claire sat hunched over her desk, bathed in the soft glow of her desk lamp. Outside, the night was deathly still, the only sound the faint hum of her building's generator. She lived alone in a creaky, old apartment complex on the outskirts of town, where rent was cheap, and the neighbors mostly kept to themselves. Her unit was on the 5th floor, with only a few tenants above her and a rickety elevator that hadn't worked in years. It was a Saturday night, and the streets were unusually quiet. As she typed away, editing a few last documents for work, she realized the silence was starting to make her uncomfortable. She glanced at the clock again, which now read 12 a.m. on the dot, just as her lamp flickered. Probably just a power surge, she muttered to herself, focusing back on her laptop. But before she could finish typing, everything went dark. Claire's heart skipped a beat, and she found herself enveloped in thick, suffocating darkness. She reached out blindly, fumbling for her phone to turn on the flashlight. When the screen glowed to life, the clock read 12:01 a.m. She shined the light around her small apartment, only to be greeted by empty shadows. But something about the darkness felt wrong. Almost alive. She tried to reassure herself. Just a blackout. It happens all the time, she whispered. But as the minutes passed, a creeping dread settled over her. She got up, holding her phone's flashlight steady, and moved toward her front door. She figured if the blackout had hit the entire building, someone else would be in the hallways with a flashlight or calling for help. Surely, she wasn't the only one awake at this hour. She opened her door a crack and peered into the hallway, half expecting to see her neighbor, Mr. Ramsey, an insomniac with a penchant for midnight walks. But the hall was empty. She stepped out, listening intently, hoping to hear the faint murmur of another resident. But all she could hear was silence, so thick it felt as if the walls themselves were swallowing it. She took a few steps forward, her bare feet padding softly on the cold tile floor, and then froze. At the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim glow of her phone's flashlight, was a figure. It was a man, his face obscured in shadow. He stood perfectly still, facing her, with his head tilted slightly to the side. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she called out, "Hello? Do you live here?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, as if it were studying her. She took a step back, feeling the door to her apartment behind her, and her first instinct was to go back inside and lock the door. But her curiosity got the better of her. She moved her flashlight up toward his face. The beam illuminated a set of vacant eyes staring back at her, cold and dead. His skin was unnaturally pale, and his mouth was twisted into an unsettling, crooked smile. Claire gasped, her body locking up in terror. But before she could scream or run, the light on her phone flickered and died, plunging her back into darkness. She fumbled with the buttons, desperately trying to turn it back on, but her phone seemed completely dead. A panicked breath escaped her lips as she realized she was now trapped in the pitch-black hallway, with that silent, grinning figure somewhere in front of her. She reached out blindly, feeling her way back to her apartment door. Her hands found the handle, and she yanked it open, stumbling inside. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. She leaned her forehead against the door, trying to calm herself, when she heard it, a soft, scratching sound from the other side of the door. It was slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was tracing a single finger along the wood, moving from top to bottom. The sound sent chills down her spine, and she pressed herself harder against the door, as if her own weight could keep it shut. The scratching continued for several agonizing minutes before it finally stopped. Claire let out a shaky breath, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. She turned away from the door, moving toward her bedroom to find her backup flashlight. But as she entered the room, she froze. The darkness felt different here, thicker, like a shroud that clung to her skin. And then she saw it, a shadow in the corner of her room, darker than the rest. It shifted slightly, its form almost human but distorted, as if it were blending with the shadows around it. Claire's mouth went dry as she took a step back. The figure moved, sliding out from the corner with an unnatural, jerky motion, like a puppet with tangled strings. It reached out a hand, impossibly long fingers stretching toward her. She stumbled back, hitting the wall, her hands scrambling for something, anything, that could serve as a weapon. Her fingers closed around a heavy bookend, and she held it in front of her like a shield. But the shadow stopped just inches away, tilting its head in that same eerie, studying manner. She didn't know how long she stood there, staring into those inky, empty eyes, until her survival instincts finally kicked in. She hurled the bookend at the shadow, but it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The shadow seemed to laugh, a low, raspy sound that echoed in her mind rather than her ears. It leaned in closer, its face inches from hers, and whispered, "You can't hide from me, Claire." Her name. The sound of it, coming from that creature, sent her into a full panic. She bolted from the room, racing back to the door. She didn't care if the man in the hallway was still there, anything was better than staying trapped in her apartment with that thing. She yanked the door open and ran into the hall, her heart hammering in her chest. But as she looked down the corridor, she saw that it was now empty. No sign of the man with the twisted smile. She took a deep breath, glancing around, wondering if anyone else was awake and had heard her. And then she heard it again. The scratching. But this time, it was coming from the walls. She backed away, watching in horror as long, thin scratches began to appear along the walls of the hallway, each one deeper and more erratic than the last. They were coming from inside the walls, as if something was trying to claw its way out. A faint, whispering voice began to echo through the hall, growing louder with each passing second. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was filled with malice. Claire covered her ears, stumbling backward, her mind racing for a way out. And then the lights flickered back on. She blinked, disoriented, as the fluorescent bulbs hummed to life, casting the hallway in their harsh, artificial glow. The scratches on the walls were gone. The shadows had vanished. She turned around, half expecting to see the twisted figure from her bedroom standing behind her, but the hallway was empty. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she pulled it out, relieved to see it had power again. She dialed her sister's number, hands shaking as she held the phone to her ear. "Claire," her sister's sleepy voice answered after a few rings. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" I don't know what happened," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "The power went out, and there was something in my apartment. In the hallway." Her sister sighed, sounding annoyed. "It was probably just your imagination. You're always working too late, Claire. Get some sleep." "No, you don't understand. There was a man, he was smiling, and then something was in my room, and..." Her voice trailed off as she realized how absurd it all sounded. "Just try to get some rest," her sister said, her voice softening slightly. "It's probably nothing. Just a blackout." Claire nodded, even though she knew her sister couldn't see her. "Okay. I'll try." She ended the call, feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with lingering dread. Maybe it had all been in her head. Maybe the darkness had just played tricks on her mind. She turned to head back to her apartment, but as she took a step forward, she froze. There, at the end of the hallway, was the figure again. The man with the vacant eyes and crooked smile, standing perfectly still, his head tilted to the side. Claire's blood ran cold as the lights flickered once more, casting the hallway in an erratic, pulsing glow. The man's smile widened, and she could see his lips moving, though no sound escaped them. But in her mind, she heard his voice, clear as day. "You can't hide from me, Claire." The lights went out again, and in the pitch darkness, she heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty hallway. And then there was silence.